That narcissist doesn't always aim to harm you in a direct or obvious way. Instead, it unfolds slowly in a quiet and carefully controlled process that is difficult to recognize while you are inside it. The goal is not only control, but the gradual removal of your identity, piece by piece, until you start feeling like you are no longer yourself. To the outside world, they often appear impressive, calm, or even kind, while behind closed doors, you begin to feel like you are fading away. Over time, your clarity, confidence, and sense of direction weaken as though something inside you is being drained. What makes it even harder is the contrast. Others see them as fine, while you appear confused or unstable. This hidden pattern leaves no visible evidence, only a personal experience of slowly losing your sense of self within the relationship. The first sign is their gaze. There is something deeply unsettling in the way they look at you, especially during the discard phase. Their eyes can feel cold, distant, and emotionally switched off, as if the connection between you has been completely shut down. Many people describe it as an empty or lifeless stare, where it feels like you are being looked through rather than truly seen. In those moments, your instincts react before logic can catch up. You feel unsafe without fully understanding why. It can feel like you are standing in front of someone who no longer relates to you as a person, only as something to be evaluated or removed. That experience often leaves you disoriented and emotionally shaken, as if the person you once knew has been replaced by someone unfamiliar and unrecognizable. The second sign is the way they isolate you without making it obvious. Instead of directly stopping you from seeing friends or family, they gradually plant doubts about the people around you. They may suggest that your friends don't truly support you, or that your family only shows up when they need something. Over time, you start questioning your own relationships and slowly pull back on your own, believing it is your decision. As your outside connections weaken, their influence grows stronger until their perspective becomes the loudest voice in your mind. This isolation can leave you feeling misunderstood and alone, especially when others cannot fully grasp what you are experiencing. Eventually, the emotional distance from everyone else deepens, and you may find yourself feeling exhausted, disconnected, and increasingly dependent within the relationship. The third sign is how they gradually destroy the very foundations that keep your life stable. Things begin to fall apart around you, but not in ways that are easy to trace back to them. You may lose opportunities or even your job, not through anything direct, but through subtle interference, creating tension, feeding doubts, or disrupting your focus right before important moments. You might find yourself exhausted and unfocused because of constant emotional conflict, arguments, or sleepless nights caused by their behavior. Even your financial judgment can start to suffer as your thinking becomes clouded and reactive. When things eventually collapse, they act detached or even smug, reminding you that you should have known better. Over time, repeated setbacks begin to reshape your self-image until you start believing you are incapable or unlucky, slowly losing trust in your own abilities and judgment. The fourth sign is how they plant the idea that you do not truly belong in your own life or even in the world around you. This is rarely said directly. Instead, it comes through quiet, casual remarks that slowly sink into your mind. They may suggest that your struggles are too heavy, that they would not be able to handle your life, or that you seem overwhelmed in a way others would not understand. These statements can sound like concern on the surface, but underneath they carry a message of separation and doubt. When you eventually express sadness or hopelessness instead of support, you may be met with indifference, discomfort, or even subtle mockery. Over time, this dynamic can distort your emotional reality, making you question your own value and place in relationships, until isolation feels like your only option rather than something being imposed on you. The fifth sign is how they manipulate your perception of other people until you start believing that the entire world is against you. They may repeatedly suggest that others do not genuinely care, that friendships are shallow, or that people only tolerate you out of obligation. Over time, this repetition can weaken your confidence in social connections, making you withdraw and second-guess everyone around you. They often intensify this by comparing you to others in a way that creates insecurity and self-doubt, presenting new people as more compliant or better suited to them. At the same time, they may twist stories or misrepresent your behavior so that others misunderstand you, slowly eroding your support system. As your connections weaken, stress and emotional exhaustion grow, and your sense of safety in the world diminishes. This creates a cycle where you feel increasingly isolated, uncertain, and disconnected from the very people who once grounded you. The sixth sign is how they carefully gather information about you, not out of genuine care, but for control. At the beginning, it can feel comforting because they seem deeply interested in your life, your past, your emotions, your fears, and the experiences you rarely share with anyone. They ask questions about your childhood, your insecurities, and the moments that shaped you, and it can feel like trust is being built. But over time, it becomes clear that nothing you share stays neutral. Those details are stored, remembered, and later brought back in moments of conflict. What you once shared in vulnerability gets reshaped and used to make you doubt yourself, to reopen old wounds, or to convince you that your weaknesses define you. Slowly, this creates a deep sense of shame and confusion, where you begin questioning your own worth and even your right to exist in relationships or in life itself. As this pattern continues, your emotional stability weakens and your inner voice becomes filled with doubt that feels like it came from your own thoughts, even though it was planted over time. You may start believing that you are beyond help, that you will never improve, or that everything wrong somehow started with you. This is where isolation becomes internal as well as external, because you stop trusting your own judgment. Eventually, even hope feels distant, and you may find yourself feeling mentally exhausted and disconnected from your sense of identity. The intention of this discussion is not fear, but awareness, because once you recognize these patterns, you can begin to step back and reclaim your clarity. If any of this feels familiar, the important thing is to ground yourself, seek support, and focus on rebuilding your sense of self one step at a time. What's really happening in these kinds of dynamics is not a single dramatic act, but a long-term erosion of your internal stability. When someone consistently targets your emotions, your relationships, your confidence, and your self-perception, the result is not just conflict. It's confusion about what is real. Over time, your mind starts relying on the other person as a reference point for reality, especially when their version of events is delivered with certainty and your own memory feels emotionally overwhelmed. That's where the deeper damage begins, because you stop trusting your internal signals and start outsourcing interpretation of your own life. A major effect of this is emotional fragmentation. You may feel like different versions of yourself exist depending on the situation. One that questions everything, one that tries to please, and one that quietly feels exhausted but can't fully explain why. This inner split is often mistaken for overthinking or being sensitive, but it is actually a response to repeated psychological pressure and inconsistency. When someone is warm at one moment and cold or punitive the next, your nervous system stays in a constant state of adjustment, trying to predict safety. Another important aspect is how shame gets conditioned into your self-image. Instead of seeing problems as situational or relational, you begin to internalize them as identity-based. That shift is powerful because it changes how you interpret everything. Mistakes become proof of inadequacy. Silence becomes rejection, and normal disagreement becomes evidence that something is wrong with you. This is how self-blame becomes automatic, even when you are not at fault. Over time, isolation doesn't always need to be enforced from the outside because it starts to happen internally. You may stop sharing things with others because you feel misunderstood, or because you've been made to doubt your own interpretation of events. This is where support systems weaken, not always because people disappear, but because you no longer feel safe using them. That loss of connection reinforces dependency on the very dynamic that is harming you. The most important shift in recovery is the return of internal trust, not blind confidence, but the ability to pause and ask, does this actually align with reality? Or is this something I've been trained to believe about myself? That small separation between experience and interpretation is where clarity begins to return. It allows you to see patterns instead of personal flaws and relationships instead of self-judgment. Healing in this context is not about instantly feeling better or rewriting the past. It's about slowly rebuilding your ability to think without distortion, feel without fear of manipulation, and connect without losing yourself. That process takes time, but the moment you start recognizing the pattern instead of absorbing it, the influence begins to weaken. Another layer that people often miss is how dependency gets built without you noticing it. It doesn't usually start as control in the obvious sense. It starts with small moments where you are encouraged to rely on them for emotional regulation, decision-making, or even clarity about your own feelings. Over time, you begin checking their reaction before trusting your own response. That shift is subtle, but it changes the entire structure of the relationship because your internal authority slowly gets replaced by external approval. This is also why leaving or detaching can feel so confusing. It is not just the loss of a person, it is the loss of a system your mind has adapted to. Even if the system was painful, it became familiar. The brain often prefers predictability over emotional freedom, especially when unpredictability has been paired with attachment. So when distance happens, there can be withdrawal-like symptoms, confusion, emotional urgency, intrusive thoughts, or a strong pull to return, not because things were healthy, but because the nervous system is trying to restore what it recognizes. Another important pattern is intermittent reinforcement, where moments of warmth, attention, or affection are mixed unpredictably with criticism, withdrawal, or coldness. This inconsistency is psychologically powerful because it keeps the mind searching for the good version of the person. Instead of walking away from pain, you start chasing relief. That chase can keep people stuck far longer than any single negative experience ever would. As this continues, your identity can become shaped around adaptation. You start modifying your behavior to avoid conflict, reduce tension, or regain connection. Slowly, parts of your personality get suppressed, not because they disappeared, but because they were not safe to express. You may not even notice what you've stopped doing until you're outside the dynamic and realize how much of yourself was on hold. What makes this especially difficult is that there are usually no clear breaking points. It is rarely one moment that proves everything. It is accumulation, small emotional injuries that don't look significant individually, but create a deep internal exhaustion over time. That's why people often describe it as losing themselves, rather than simply being hurt. Recovery starts when you begin to separate intensity from truth. Just because something feels urgent, emotional, or overwhelming doesn't mean it is accurate. Learning to slow down your interpretation of experiences helps you step out of automatic responses. From there, your thoughts start becoming observations again instead of commands, and that shift is where personal stability begins to return. Another important piece is how perception gets trained over time. In a healthy dynamic, your interpretation of events is usually confirmed or corrected through open communication. But in a manipulative or emotionally unsafe dynamic, your interpretation is often challenged, dismissed, or reframed until you start doubting it. This repeated invalidation doesn't just create disagreement, it creates uncertainty about your own judgment. And once that uncertainty becomes strong enough, you begin to second-guess even your most basic emotional responses. This is where self-distrust quietly develops. You might feel something is wrong, but immediately question whether you are overreacting. You might notice disrespect, but then rationalize it before you can fully process it. Over time, this becomes automatic, and your mind starts filtering reality through a lens of self-doubt before anything else. That is one of the most destabilizing effects because it disconnects you from your instinctive clarity. Another layer is how emotional exhaustion builds in the background. It is not always dramatic. It often shows up as constant mental fatigue, difficulty focusing, or feeling emotionally heavy, even in neutral situations. This happens because your mind is continuously processing threat, meaning it stays in analysis mode instead of rest mode. Even when nothing is happening in the moment, your nervous system remains alert, anticipating the next shift in mood or behavior. This ongoing tension can slowly reshape your baseline state. What once felt calm starts to feel unfamiliar, and what is actually stress begins to feel normal. That shift is dangerous because it hides the severity of what you are experiencing. When stress becomes your baseline, you stop recognizing it as something that needs attention. Another subtle effect is how your personal boundaries begin to blur. You might start accepting behavior you would have rejected earlier, not because your values changed, but because your threshold for discomfort has been gradually adjusted. Each small compromise feels insignificant in isolation, but together they form a pattern where your emotional limits move further away from your true needs. What breaks this cycle is not force or sudden change, but awareness that your internal state has been conditioned. Once you start noticing, this reaction feels learned rather than natural. You create space between yourself and the pattern. That space is where choice returns, and where you can begin rebuilding responses that are based on clarity instead of conditioning. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is how guilt is used as a control mechanism. It is not always direct blame or confrontation. More often, it appears in subtle emotional framing that makes you feel responsible for the other person's moods, reactions, or suffering. Over time, you begin to associate their discomfort with your behavior, even when there is no real connection. This creates a constant internal pressure to manage not just yourself, but also their emotional state. This kind of guilt conditioning slowly trains you to overfunction in the relationship. You may find yourself explaining more, apologizing more, and trying harder to prevent conflict before it even happens. It can feel like you are being considerate, but underneath it is a growing fear of emotional consequences. That fear keeps you reactive instead of grounded, always adjusting yourself instead of staying centered. Another important pattern is how your reality becomes socially weakened. When your experiences are repeatedly minimized or reframed, you may stop sharing them with others because it feels pointless or confusing. This creates a gap between your inner experience and external validation. Without outside reflection, your mind has fewer reference points to confirm what is real, which makes you more dependent on the same dynamic that is distorting your perception. At the same time, moments of clarity often come and go. You may occasionally see the situation for what it is, but then doubt creeps in and pulls you back into uncertainty. This push and pull creates cognitive fatigue, where even simple decisions start to feel mentally heavy. It is not just emotional pain, it is the exhaustion of constantly reevaluating your own reality. Another important dimension is how reality distortion becomes gradual rather than sudden. It rarely feels like someone is rewriting your world overnight. Instead, it happens through repeated reframing of small events until your memory and interpretation begin to shift. A situation you clearly experienced one way gets described differently, and over time, the repeated version starts to compete with your own recollection. When this happens often enough, you stop feeling fully confident about what actually occurred, even when you were present for it. Another important layer is how your emotional identity starts getting shaped around reaction instead of authenticity. Instead of simply responding from what you feel, you begin responding to avoid consequences, reduce tension, or regain approval. That means your behavior slowly becomes strategic rather than natural. You are no longer just expressing yourself. You are managing outcomes. Over time, this creates a disconnect between who you are and how you behave in that environment. This also affects how you experience your own emotions. Feelings like anger, sadness, or disappointment don't get processed normally because they are immediately filtered through fear of conflict or rejection. So instead of expressing them, you suppress them, explain them away, or turn them inward. When emotions are repeatedly interrupted like this, they don't disappear, they accumulate. That accumulation often shows up later as emotional overwhelm, anxiety, or sudden breakdowns that seem to come out of nowhere. Another subtle effect is how your confidence in decision-making weakens. Even simple choices can start to feel uncertain because you've been conditioned to doubt your instincts. You might find yourself seeking reassurance for things you once decided without hesitation. This doesn't happen because you are incapable, but because your internal signals have been repeatedly overridden or questioned, making it harder to trust them. There is also a gradual shift in how you interpret effort. You may begin to believe that relationships are supposed to feel constantly difficult, emotionally heavy, or confusing, This belief forms quietly when prolonged stress becomes normalized. As a result, you may stop recognizing imbalance as imbalance and instead interpret it as something you need to endure or fix alone. What begins to reverse this pattern is relearning emotional permission. Allowing yourself to feel something without immediately justifying it or minimizing it creates space for authenticity again. When you start acknowledging, "This is what I feel," without immediately editing it, your emotional system begins to stabilize. That stability slowly rebuilds trust in your own internal experience, which is the foundation for clearer thinking, healthier boundaries, and more grounded relationships moving forward. This creates a state where certainty becomes rare. You may find yourself replaying conversations, trying to confirm details, or looking for external validation just to feel grounded. The mind starts to rely less on direct experience and more on interpretation through the other person's lens. That is where confusion deepens, because your internal narrative is no longer stable. Another pattern is emotional conditioning through reward and withdrawal. When warmth, attention, or approval is inconsistent, your brain starts to become highly sensitive to small moments of connection. You begin to overvalue brief periods of calm or affection because they relieve tension. This can make the relationship feel more significant than it objectively is, not because of its depth, but because of the relief it provides from stress. At the same time, your tolerance for discomfort increases. What once felt unacceptable becomes something you adapt to in order to maintain stability. This is not acceptance in a healthy sense. It is adjustment under pressure. Over time, this can lead to emotional numbness, where intense situations no longer feel as shocking as they should simply because your system has normalized them. Another effect is how your future thinking becomes restricted. Instead of imagining expansion, opportunity, or growth, your thoughts begin to revolve around survival within the current dynamic. You start planning your emotional energy around avoiding conflict rather than building a life that feels fulfilling. This narrowing of perspective is one of the quietest but most powerful outcomes of prolonged psychological stress. Another deeper effect is how your nervous system begins to associate closeness with tension. Instead of feeling safe in emotional intimacy, your body starts preparing for conflict, misunderstanding, or emotional withdrawal. This means even neutral moments can feel slightly uneasy, because your system has learned to anticipate unpredictability. Over time, that anticipation becomes constant background stress, even when nothing is actively happening. This creates a kind of emotional hyper-awareness. You start reading tone, facial expressions, timing, and small behavioral shifts more intensely than before. Not because you want to, but because your mind is trying to predict emotional outcomes in advance. This state can feel like overthinking, but at its core, it is a survival adaptation to inconsistency. The mind learns that paying closer attention might help prevent emotional disruption. Another important aspect is how self-expression becomes filtered. You may begin to censor yourself before speaking, not because you lack opinions, but because you are unconsciously calculating how your words might be received. This filtering process reduces spontaneity and increases internal pressure. Over time, conversations stop feeling like free expression and start feeling like controlled navigation. At the same time, your emotional memory can become selective in a distorted way. You may vividly remember moments of hurt or confusion while struggling to recall moments of clarity or calm. This imbalance reinforces a narrative of instability, even when the full picture is more complex. It strengthens the belief that something is fundamentally wrong, rather than recognizing the cyclical nature of the experience. Another effect is how hope becomes intermittent. You may have brief moments where everything feels clear and you see the situation accurately, followed by periods of doubt where that clarity disappears. This fluctuation is exhausting because it prevents stable decision-making. You begin to question your own insights simply because they are not constant, even though inconsistency is a natural result of emotional stress. What gradually helps reverse this is consistency outside the dynamic. Spaces where your thoughts are not constantly challenged or reshaped. When your perception is reflected back to you in a stable and supportive way, your internal clarity stops being disrupted. Over time, this allows your nervous system to settle, your thinking to stabilize, and your sense of self to become less reactive and more grounded in reality again. What slowly reverses this is reintroducing external reference points, other relationships, honest feedback, or even journaling your own experiences without reinterpretation. These anchors help rebuild consistency between what you feel, what you remember, and what actually happened. Over time, that consistency restores mental clarity, and clarity is what allows you to step out of confusion and back into grounded decision making. Over time, this can affect your sense of agency. Decisions that used to feel straightforward begin to feel loaded with anxiety. You may hesitate, delay, or seek reassurance repeatedly before acting. That hesitation is not indecisiveness in the normal sense. It is a response to prolonged self-doubt conditioning. The turning point begins when you start observing your reactions instead of immediately believing them. When you notice, I am feeling guilty, but is this guilt actually mine or is it being triggered? You create a small but powerful interruption in the pattern. That interruption allows you to respond instead of react, and with repetition, it gradually restores your internal authority. What ties all of this together is not a single behavior, but a gradual reshaping of how you see yourself, how you interpret others, and how you move through your own life. When someone consistently distorts your emotions, challenges your perceptions, isolates you from support, and mixes moments of connection with moments of confusion, the result is not just pain, it is disorientation. You stop trusting your instincts, not because they are wrong, but because they are constantly being overridden, questioned, or reframed until they no longer feel reliable. Over time, your internal world becomes quieter, not because you have found peace, but because you have learned to suppress your own signals in order to maintain stability in the relationship. That silence inside you is often mistaken for acceptance, but in reality, it is adaptation under pressure. You begin to prioritize avoiding conflict over expressing truth, avoiding abandonment over maintaining boundaries, and avoiding discomfort over honoring your own emotional clarity. Slowly, your identity starts to revolve around survival within the dynamic rather than expression outside of it. What makes this process especially complex is that it rarely feels extreme while it is happening. There are still moments of normalcy, occasional warmth, and periods where things seem almost okay. Those moments can create hope, and that hope often keeps people invested far longer than they intended. But beneath those fluctuations, the nervous system is constantly adjusting, scanning, and trying to predict the next shift. That ongoing internal vigilance becomes exhausting, even if you cannot fully explain why you feel so drained. At a deeper level, the real impact is the erosion of self-trust. When you cannot consistently rely on your own interpretation of events, you begin to outsource your certainty to the very environment that is confusing you. That creates a loop where the more uncertain you feel, the more you look outward for clarity, and the more you look outward, the less confident you become internally. Breaking that loop does not happen through one insight or one decision. It happens through repeated moments of noticing your internal experience without immediately abandoning it. Recovery is not about labeling everything perfectly or proving what happened. It is about rebuilding the relationship you have with your own mind. It is learning to sit with your thoughts long enough to separate fear from fact, conditioning from truth, and emotional intensity from actual meaning. That separation is where clarity begins to return, slowly and steadily. And once clarity starts to return, something important shifts. You no longer feel trapped inside interpretations that were handed to you. You start to see patterns instead of chaos, dynamics instead of personal failure, and responses instead of identity flaws. That shift does not erase what you went through, but it stops it from defining who you are. In the end, the goal is not to stay stuck analyzing what was done to you, but to return to yourself with enough awareness that you can no longer be pulled so deeply into confusion again. The more you reconnect with your own perception, the less power distortion has over you. And with time, What once felt like mental noise becomes clarity. What once felt like self doubt becomes discernment. And what once felt like loss becomes the beginning of self return.